Let's take a step back from the state of modern America and go back to New York in the mid 1800s.
We'll be delving into the history of one of New York's most iconic landmarks, Central Park. But more specifically, what Central Park was to Manhattan before it was Central Park.
In the 1830s, most of New York's population lived in Lower Manhattan. With the emancipation of slaves, more and more free African Americans joined the workforce. Job competition increased and violence ensued. Upper Manhattan, on the other hand, was not as heavily developed. In 1825, plots of land began to go for sale, and a black man named Andrew Williams bought 3 lots. Following his purchase, many other black families began to move in. This led to the birth of Seneca Village. Over the following 30 years, the community grew to almost 300 residents, including some European immigrants. Living in Seneca Village had many benefits for minorities. It was affordable, safe, and it enabled minorities' voting rights by fulfilling property ownership requirements.
However, with surges in the city's population, the city's white elite called for a park for an escape from the urban jungle.
City officials responded by setting aside 750 acres of land, including Seneca Village. In an effort to justify this action, the city newspaper criminalized the 1,600 residents and even referred to the community with slurs and derogatory insults. While they were compensated for their land, they were forced to move, and many said that their land was undervalued.
In 1856, Seneca Village was seized and destroyed and replaced with pathways, bridges, arches, and thousands of trees, the land we know today as Central Park.
Next, we'll be looking into an incident in 1921, referred to in our textbook as the Tulsa Race Riot.
After World War I, millions of African Americans who had contributed to the war effort emerged determined to achieve citizenship rights. With the migration of Southern blacks to northern and Midwestern cities, whites were now in competition with blacks for jobs and housing. This deepened existing racial tensions and sparked white violence, causing a spike in racially charged hate crimes such as lynchings and homicides.
One example of this was in 1921 in the railroad town of Rosewood, Florida, where mobs of whites burned down houses and massacred the black population while police refused to intervene.
However, one of the worst episodes of racial violence in the U.S. occurred in the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Greenwood district was a prosperous black community and referred to as Black Wall Street. Black Wall Street was an anomaly. It thrived at the same time the KKK was at its peak. In fact, this was the same time as the Red Summer of 1919, when white mobs were continually attacking and murdering black individuals in the U.S.
On May 30th, 1921, a black man named Dick Rowland entered an elevator with a white woman named Sarah Page, who was the elevator operator. During the elevator ride, Page screamed, and both Page and Rowland ran out of the elevator. The next day, Rowland was arrested and taken to the courthouse. Despite Page refusing to press charges, a newspaper article written about the event inflamed anger in the white community. A white mob gathered outside the courthouse, while black men went to protect Rowland, who was in jail at the courthouse. Conflict ensued, and the white mob, armed, proceeded to storm the Greenwood district. The whites murdered, looted, and burned down all of Black Wall Street.
When it was all over, 300 black people had been murdered and 10,000 lost their property. Yet not a single person was convicted. The black community was left to pick up what little remained of their neighborhood. After the massacre, the event was essentially erased from history. Newspapers rushed to cover up and rewrite the massacre, archives from police and city records were destroyed, and no memorials were held. To this day, the bodies from the massacre are still missing.
In our research, we noticed that the textbook continually referred to black massacres as riots. This is indicative of a larger historical problem unmentioned in the textbook. White supremacists kept trophies such as postcards of their hate crimes with pictures of destroyed property of black communities. One example of this was Tulsa, where on the postcards, the incident is referred to as a riot.
Seneca Village and Tulsa serve as prominent examples of successful Black communities destroyed by white resentment. By destroying Black individuals as property, businesses, communities, and means of life, white mobs destroyed these people's opportunities for accumulating wealth through property and further inhibited Black individuals' economic development, which was already hindered by slavery and white dominance of land.
According to the Economic Policy Institute, today on average, white Americans have 7 times the wealth of Black Americans. And though Black Americans make up nearly 13% of the US population, they hold less than 3% of the nation's total wealth. Additionally, the median family wealth for white Americans is $171,000 compared with just $17,600 for Black Americans. 19% of Black households also have zero or negative net worth. Just 9% of white families are that poor.
Despite common sentiments, wealth and social mobility are not purely attainable by means such as income, employment, and education. Wealth is something that is accumulated over time and over generations. The primary way wealth in America is accumulated is through property. In fact, 2/3 of America's middle-class wealth is in the form of home ownership. The racial wealth gap in the US is primarily a housing gap.
To understand the racial wealth gap in America, we must first understand the basics of American housing. When someone wants to buy a house, they'll first borrow the majority of the cost from a bank. This is called a mortgage loan. If the borrower stops paying back the money for the mortgage, or in other words, defaults on the mortgage holder will get their house. It is important to understand that bad credit or an unstable income makes it incredibly difficult to obtain a mortgage, and as a result, nearly impossible to buy property.
Now, we'll be examining one of the most influential programs in relation to racial economic inequality, FDR's New Deal.
With his New Deal, FDR introduced many social programs. The most prominent in relation to our topic was the Federal Housing Act of 1934, created to make housing affordable again. Under the Federal Housing Act, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or the HOLC, was created to ensure that home buyers would not default on their mortgages. The HOLC created residential security maps that classified neighborhoods by financial stability, which led to what we know today as redlining.
Green was for homeowners least likely to default on their mortgages, such as businessmen. Blue for white-collar families, yellow for working-class families, and finally red, which meant hazardous, detrimental influences, reserved for foreign-born people, low-class whites, and most of all, Blacks.
However, it is important to note that studies proved that people living in redline districts were not more likely to default on their mortgages.
The HOLC excluded red areas, minority neighborhoods, from government-insured loans and thus created a self-reinforcing cycle of landlords abandoning their properties, declining city services, increasing crime rates, and dropping property values. So while high-income white neighborhoods would receive investment through loans and mortgages, residents of lower-income areas, especially in Black communities, would be denied loans and mortgages.
Over the next 30 years, white home buyers migrated to suburbs and established discriminatory rules called racial covenants. To avoid getting redlined, land developers, realtors, and community residents wrote these covenants on property deeds, explicitly and legally forbidding the sale of homes to minorities. White homeowners feared that if one Black person moved to their community, many others would follow. They also feared that if this happened, property values would drop.
In 1968, the Fair Housing Act, passed under Johnson's administration, deemed redlining and racial covenants illegal. However, by then, the issue was too deeply ingrained in America's society to be corrected. The act went unenforced, and redlining was a social practice unamendable by legal reform. Racial covenants continued in white neighborhoods, socially enforced by threats. These two practices sustained segregation and prevented minorities from building wealth through property.
It is important to realize that even African American families that earn decent incomes were barred from accessing the housing market, the most important financial market for growing wealth.